When people hear about Miami's grand estates, most think of modern glass towers, celebrity mansions stretching along pristine beaches, and the glittering wealth of contemporary luxury. But long before Miami became a playground for the ultra-rich, long before Art Deco hotels lined Ocean Drive, and long before the city transformed into a global destination, one man created something entirely different. Hidden among the tropical vegetation of Biscayne Bay sits Villa Vizcaya, a palace that seems impossibly out of place in time. Italian Renaissance architecture rises from Florida wilderness. Formal European gardens bloom in subtropical heat. Ancient stone columns stand where mangrove swamps once grew. The estate looks like it belongs in Tuscany or Venice, transplanted somehow to the edge of the Everglades. The man who built this fantasy was James Deering, heir to one of America's greatest industrial fortunes. Between 1914 and 1922, he spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars creating an elaborate illusion. A villa that appeared centuries old, but was completely new. Gardens that seemed to have matured over generations, but were carefully staged. An entire world constructed to look like something it was not. Some called it a masterpiece of design. Others called it America's most elaborate architectural fantasy. Villa Vizcaya wasn't just a mansion. It was a carefully constructed dream, built by a man who wanted to escape his own time and live surrounded by the beauty of the past. But beneath the surface of carved limestone and Renaissance paintings, Villa Vizcaya holds secrets about American wealth, cultural ambition, and the power of illusion. The villa's beauty is real, but almost nothing else about it is what it appears to be. Before we can understand what Deering created and why it still fascinates us today, we need to go back to the beginning, to an industrialist's son who fell in love with a past that was never truly his. If you're fascinated by historic estates, architectural mysteries, and the stories hidden inside America's grandest mansions, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which historic mansion we should explore next. Your support makes these detailed documentaries possible. Now, let's discover how a millionaire built his own illusion in the Florida wilderness. Chapter 1. The Industrialist's Son, April 7, 1859, South Paris, Maine. James Deering was born into a world on the edge of transformation. America was recovering from economic panic, the Civil War loomed just 2 years ahead, and the country's future would be shaped by the machines that could harvest its vast farmlands. His father, William Deering, understood this better than most. William Deering was not an inventor in the traditional sense, but he recognized genius when he saw it. He had invested in Cyrus McCormick's Reaper technology and understood that American agriculture needed better, faster, more efficient harvesting machines. As the country expanded westward, farmers needed tools that could handle vast acreages of wheat, corn, and grain. William saw opportunity where others saw only fields. Young James grew up surrounded by the sound of machinery, the smell of factories, and the relentless rhythm of American industry. The Deering Company, based in Chicago, became one of the leading manufacturers of agricultural equipment in the United States. Reapers, mowers, binders, these machines transformed farming from backbreaking manual labor into mechanized efficiency. The Deering name became synonymous with progress, innovation, and the modernization of American agriculture. But James himself was different from his father. While William loved business, negotiation, and the practical work of building a company, James seemed drawn to something else entirely. He was quieter, more contemplative, more interested in beauty than in machinery. His health was never strong. Respiratory problems plagued him from childhood, making the cold Chicago winters difficult and the smoky factory air unbearable. By the time James reached adulthood, the Deering Company had grown into an empire. In 1902, it merged with several competitors to form the International Harvester Company, one of the largest corporations in America. The merger made the Deering family extraordinarily wealthy. William's share of International Harvester stock was worth millions, and James, as his son, would inherit a fortune that most people could barely comprehend. Yet wealth did not bring James health. His doctors recommended warmer climates, cleaner air, escape from the industrial cities where his family's fortune had been made. He began traveling, first to the American South, then to Europe. It was in Europe that James Deering discovered something that would change the course of his life. The Grand Tour was a tradition among wealthy Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Young men and women of means would spend months or even years traveling through Europe, visiting museums, studying art and architecture, purchasing antiques and cultural artifacts to bring home. It was considered essential education for the American upper class, a way to acquire the cultural refinement that new money alone could not provide. James took multiple trips to Europe, visiting Italy, France, Spain, and England. He walked through Renaissance palaces in Florence and Venice. He explored ancient Roman ruins. He studied the formal gardens of French estates and the intimate courtyards of Spanish villas. He purchased paintings, sculptures, furniture, tapestries, architectural fragments, anything beautiful he could bring back to America. These trips shaped his aesthetic sensibilities and his vision for what a home could be. He didn't want a modern mansion filled with the latest conveniences and fashionable designs. He wanted to recreate the beauty he had found in Europe, to build a place where he could live surrounded by the art and architecture of the Renaissance, a time he considered more beautiful, more refined, more meaningful than his own industrial age. By 1910, James had made a decision. He would build a winter residence somewhere warm, somewhere his health could improve, somewhere he could escape the cold northern winters and create his own private world of beauty. His doctors had recommended Florida. The state was still relatively undeveloped, more frontier than resort, but the climate was ideal for someone with respiratory problems. Warm, humid air, gentle winters, tropical vegetation that stayed green year-round. James began exploring the Florida coast, looking for the perfect location. He considered several sites before discovering a stretch of land along Biscayne Bay, just south of the small town of Miami. The property was wild, thick with native vegetation, mangrove swamps, and dense tropical growth. Mosquitoes filled the air. The heat was intense, but the location was perfect. The land faced west, overlooking the calm waters of Biscayne Bay. The sunsets would be spectacular. The bay itself provided natural beauty and a sense of openness that James loved. The property was large enough to accommodate not just a house, but extensive gardens, outbuildings, and all the infrastructure needed for a self-contained estate. In 1912, James Deering purchased 180 acres of waterfront land. The purchase price was modest by his standards. Land in Florida was cheap, especially land that seemed unsuitable for development. But James didn't see wilderness. He saw possibility. He envisioned Italian gardens rising from the swamps, a Renaissance palace overlooking the bay, a complete world that would transport him and his guests away from modern America and into the beauty of the European past. To bring this vision to life, James knew he needed the best designers, architects, and artists he could find. He didn't want something merely expensive. He wanted something perfect, something that would look and feel like it had existed for centuries, even though it would be completely new. This wasn't just about building a house. This was about creating an illusion so complete, so convincing, that visitors would forget they were in Florida at all. The man who would help him achieve this impossible vision was already waiting. Paul Chalfin, an artist, aesthete, and cultural advisor, had been working with wealthy clients for years, helping them acquire European art and design their homes. James hired him as artistic director for the entire project, giving him almost unlimited authority to make the vision real. Together, they would create something unprecedented in American architecture. The stage was set, the land was purchased, the team was assembled. What would rise from the Florida wilderness over the next decade would become one of the most extraordinary estates in America, a monument to beauty, wealth, and the power of illusion. Chapter 2. Assembling the Dream the land James Deering purchased in 1912 looked nothing like the manicured paradise it would become. Stretching along the western shore of Biscayne Bay, the property was thick with native Florida vegetation, mangrove swamps, and dense tropical growth. Mosquitoes filled the air. The heat was oppressive. Snakes moved through the underbrush. To most people, it would have seemed an unlikely place to build anything, much less a palace. But Paul Chalfin saw what James saw: possibility. The artistic director arrived in Miami and began walking the property, studying the land, imagining how European architecture could exist in this tropical setting. Chalfin was not an architect himself, but he understood art, design, and the power of atmosphere. He had studied in Paris, worked in museums, and developed relationships with dealers and collectors across Europe. He knew how to find beautiful things and how to arrange them into meaningful spaces. For the architectural work, Chalfin recommended F. Burrall Hoffman Jr., a young architect who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hoffman understood classical proportions, Renaissance design principles, and how to create buildings that felt both grand and intimate. He would be responsible for translating Deering's vision into actual blueprints, structural plans, and construction documents. The landscape required someone equally talented. Chalfin brought in Diego Suarez, a Colombian landscape architect who had trained in Italy and understood how to create formal European gardens. Suarez would face an enormous challenge. Italian Renaissance gardens relied on specific plants, carefully controlled water features, and a temperate climate that allowed for precise horticultural planning. Florida offered none of these advantages. The climate was subtropical, prone to hurricanes, brutally hot in summer, and filled with plants that grew aggressively rather than staying within designed boundaries. Together, these three men, Deering, Chalfin, and Hoffman, began developing plans for what they called Villa Vizcaya. The name itself was carefully chosen. Vizcaya was a province in northern Spain, suggesting European heritage and Old World sophistication. The name sounded romantic, historical, meaningful. It suggested that the estate had deep roots, even though those roots were entirely invented. The design philosophy was radical for its time. Deering didn't want a reproduction of a specific Italian villa. He wanted something that felt like it had evolved over centuries, as if multiple generations had added to the structure, modified it, expanded it, and filled it with treasures collected across decades. The villa would look like it had a history, even though that history would be entirely fabricated. Chalfin began making trips to Europe, traveling through Italy, France, and Spain with a specific mission. He purchased architectural fragments, ancient columns, carved doorways, decorative ironwork, anything that could be incorporated into the new villa to give it an authentic feel. These weren't reproductions. They were actual pieces of European history, removed from their original contexts and prepared for shipping to Florida. Some of these fragments came from demolished buildings. Others were purchased from impoverished noble families selling off pieces of their estates. The early 20th century was a time when European aristocracy was declining and American wealth was rising. Many old families needed money, and collectors like Deering were willing to pay for pieces of European heritage. It was legal, but it represented a kind of cultural transfer, moving Europe's artistic legacy across the Atlantic to decorate American homes. The architectural style they chose was Mediterranean Revival, a loose term that encompassed elements of Italian Renaissance, Spanish Baroque, and Venetian Gothic design. The villa would have stucco walls, tile roofs, arched windows, loggias, and courtyards. It would feel distinctly European while adapting to the Florida climate. Through practical modifications like higher ceilings for air circulation and broader eaves for shade. One of the most important early decisions involved the estate's relationship to Biscayne Bay. The villa would face the water, with gardens stretching down to the shoreline. Chalfin envisioned a dramatic stone breakwater in the bay itself, designed to look like an elaborate Venetian barge. This structure would serve a practical purpose, protecting the shoreline from erosion, but it would also function as sculpture, a fantastical element that would become one of Vizcaya's most recognizable features. The planning process took more than 2 years. Every detail was debated, refined, and reconsidered. How many rooms would the villa have? What materials would be used? How would the gardens be arranged? Where would service areas be hidden? How could modern conveniences like electricity and plumbing be incorporated without breaking the historical illusion? Deering was involved in every decision, but he trusted his team. He understood that creating a convincing illusion required expertise he didn't possess. Chalfin would handle aesthetics and art acquisition. Hoffman would manage architecture and construction. Suarez would create the gardens. Deering would provide the vision and, more importantly, the money to make it all possible. By 1914, the plans were complete. The team had been assembled. The first European fragments had been purchased and were being shipped to Florida. The property had been surveyed and prepared for construction. Workers were being hired. Materials were being ordered. Miami was about to witness one of the most ambitious construction projects in its history. What would rise from the Florida wilderness over the next 8 years would challenge every assumption about what American architecture could be. Villa Vizcaya would not look like anything else in the United States. It would seem to belong to a different time, a different place, a different world entirely. Chapter 3. Building the Illusion. When construction began at Villa Vizcaya in 1914, the building site became one of the largest employers in Miami. In a city that was still more frontier town than modern metropolis, hundreds of workers descended on the property each day. Craftsmen, artisans, laborers, and specialists worked side by side, transforming James Deering's vision into limestone, stucco, and marble. The workforce was extraordinary in both size and diversity. At peak construction, more than 1,000 men worked on the estate. This represented roughly 10% of Miami's entire population at the time. Local laborers cleared land and performed heavy construction work. European craftsmen were brought in for specialized tasks, carving stone, installing mosaics, and creating decorative plasterwork. Italian stonemasons worked alongside American carpenters. Spanish tile setters collaborated with local painters. The site became a small international community, united by the single purpose of building Deering's dream. Housing this workforce required infrastructure of its own. Deering established a village on the property where workers could live during construction. The village included dormitories, a dining hall, and basic amenities. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, but it also revealed something about the scale of the project. This wasn't just building a house. This was creating an entire world from nothing. The construction challenges were immense. Florida's climate worked against almost everything the builders tried to accomplish. The heat was brutal. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees, and the humidity made physical labor exhausting. Mosquitoes and other insects plagued the workers. Afternoon thunderstorms interrupted work almost daily during the rainy season. The tropical environment seemed determined to resist the imposition of European architecture. The site itself presented problems. Much of the land was swamp and required extensive filling and grading before construction could begin. The water table was high, making foundation work difficult. The soil was sandy and unstable in places, requiring careful engineering to support the weight of stone walls and heavy architectural elements. Every aspect of construction had to account for conditions that Italian or French builders would never have encountered. Yet the most remarkable aspect of the construction wasn't overcoming these practical challenges. It was the deliberate effort to make everything look old. Deering and Chalfin didn't want a crisp new building. They wanted a villa that appeared to have weathered centuries. To achieve this, workers employed techniques that seemed almost perverse. New stone was artificially aged, distressed to look worn by time and weather. Craftsmen used acid washes to create the appearance of centuries of rain damage. They deliberately chipped edges to suggest age and wear. They applied special plasters and paints formulated to look faded and weathered. The work required skill and artistry. Making something look authentically old is harder than making it look perfectly new. The workers had to understand how real aging occurs, how stone weathers, how paint fades, how materials change over time, and then recreate those effects artificially. The European fragments that Chalfin purchased added to this illusion of age. Ancient Roman columns, genuinely centuries old, were incorporated into new construction. Carved doorways from French monasteries were installed in freshly built walls. Wrought iron gates from Spanish estates were hung in modern openings. These authentic pieces gave the villa credibility, suggesting that the entire structure had similar historical depth, even though most of it was completely new. Materials came from around the world: Italian marble for floors and decorative elements, Spanish tiles for roofs and courtyards, French limestone for certain architectural details. The shipping alone was a logistical marvel. Heavy stone pieces had to be transported by ship across the Atlantic, then by rail to Florida, then by truck to the construction site. Each piece had to be carefully packed, protected from damage, tracked through the shipping process, and delivered at the right time in the construction sequence. The main house took shape slowly. The structure was built using modern steel and concrete for strength and stability, but these modern materials were concealed behind traditional facades. The walls looked like solid stone masonry. But the stone was often a thin veneer over modern structural systems. It was architecture as theater, creating an appearance that suggested one kind of construction while actually employing another. World War I, which began the same year as construction, complicated everything. European suppliers became unreliable. Shipping across the Atlantic became dangerous. Some of the craftsmen Chalfin wanted to hire were unable to leave Europe. Materials became scarce and expensive. The war forced delays and required constant improvisation. Projects that might have taken months stretched into years. Despite these challenges, the work continued. Deering was patient and committed. He understood that creating something truly extraordinary required time. He was willing to wait for the right materials, the right craftsmen, the right solutions to each problem. Money was never the limitation. Quality was the only standard that mattered. By 1916, the main house was structurally complete, though interior work would continue for several more years. The building rose 3 stories from its limestone base, topped with a terracotta tile roof in the Mediterranean style. Loggias and terraces opened onto views of the bay and gardens. The architecture managed to feel both grand and intimate, imposing yet welcoming. The final cost of Villa Vizcaya has been estimated at approximately $15 million, an astronomical sum in the 1910s and 1920s. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation, the estate would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. It represented one of the most expensive private construction projects in American history. In 1922, Villa Vizcaya stood complete along the shores of Biscayne Bay. From the water, it looked like a palazzo that might have graced the Venetian countryside for hundreds of years. The stone appeared weathered by time. The gardens seemed to have matured over decades. The entire estate radiated an aura of history and permanence. Only those who knew the truth understood that this ancient-looking villa was barely 10 years old. The illusion was complete. Deering had created his dream, a piece of Renaissance Europe transplanted to tropical Florida, looking as if it had always been there. Chapter 4. The Villa Revealed. Entering Villa Vizcaya through its main entrance, visitors stepped into a world that seemed to exist outside of time. The entrance courtyard, modeled after Italian Renaissance designs, featured weathered stone walls, a central fountain, and climbing vines that suggested centuries of growth. The fountain's gentle sound created immediate calm, washing away the noise and heat of the world beyond the gates. The courtyard served multiple purposes. It provided a transition space between the outside world and the villa's interior. It created a sense of arrival, making entry feel ceremonial rather than casual. It established the aesthetic language that would dominate the entire estate, European formality softened by tropical vegetation and natural light. From the courtyard, visitors entered the East Loggia, an open-air corridor that ran along the bayside of the villa. This space perfectly demonstrated Deering's design philosophy. The loggia featured genuine Venetian Gothic columns dating from the 16th century, purchased from a dealer in Italy and shipped across the Atlantic. These authentic fragments were incorporated into a new structure, creating the impression that the entire building shared their age and provenance. The loggia opened onto spectacular views of Biscayne Bay and the gardens that stretched down to the water. Deering designed this space for sitting, for conversation, for enjoying the Florida climate while surrounded by European architectural beauty. The open arches allowed breezes to flow through, providing natural cooling. The ceiling featured decorative painting in the Italian style, adding color and visual interest overhead. Beyond the loggia lay the reception room, the first formal interior space visitors encountered. This room established the villa's commitment to blending authentic antiques with carefully designed reproductions. The ceiling was imported from an Italian palazzo, dismantled piece by piece, shipped to Florida, and reassembled. It featured elaborate painted decoration and carved wooden beams that were genuinely centuries old. The furniture in the reception room included both authentic Renaissance pieces and modern creations designed to match. Chalfin understood that filling the entire villa with genuine antiques would be impossible and prohibitively expensive, even for Deering. Instead, he mixed periods and styles strategically, using authentic pieces to anchor each room while surrounding them with high-quality reproductions that complemented rather than competed. The living room was the largest and most impressive entertaining space in the villa. The ceiling soared to dramatic heights. creating a sense of grandeur that immediately announced the room's importance. Massive tapestries hung on the walls, depicting classical scenes and adding texture, color, and a sense of European aristocratic tradition. The fireplace, though rarely needed in Florida's climate, featured an elaborate mantel carved from marble and transported from a French estate. What made the living room remarkable was not just its size or decoration, but the quality of light that filled it. Large windows overlooked the gardens, allowing natural daylight to pour inside. The room felt bright and airy despite its formal decoration, avoiding the dark heaviness that characterized many European interiors. This was European design adapted for Florida living, maintaining aesthetic authenticity while acknowledging practical realities of climate and light. The music room served as both performance space and intimate gathering area. Deering loved music and wanted a space where concerts could be held for small audiences of friends and guests. The room featured excellent acoustics, carefully designed decorative elements that wouldn't interfere with sound quality, and period instruments that added to the historical atmosphere. French decorative elements dominated this space, giving it a lighter, more delicate feeling than the more masculine living room. The dining room was designed for formal entertaining on a grand scale. The table could accommodate dozens of guests, and the room's decoration emphasized European aristocratic dining traditions. The table itself was an authentic Renaissance piece, massive and imposing, suggesting centuries of noble meals and important conversations. Service areas were carefully hidden, allowing staff to appear and disappear without disrupting the room's historical atmosphere. Smaller spaces off the main entertaining rooms included a tea room decorated in a more intimate style, perfect for afternoon gatherings and quiet conversations. These spaces demonstrated Chalfin's skill at creating variety within a coherent aesthetic framework. Each room had its own character, its own mood, its own purpose, yet they all felt like parts of a unified whole. Throughout the main floor, Deering and Chalfin employed a consistent technique. Authentic European fragments, columns, ceiling elements, doorways, mantels were embedded in new construction. These genuine pieces gave each room credibility, suggesting that everything around them shared similar age and authenticity. The technique was sophisticated and effective. Most visitors never questioned whether they were seeing genuine Renaissance architecture or a brilliant modern recreation. The color palettes varied from room to room but maintained an overall harmony. Earth tones dominated, ochres and terracottas and warm browns, punctuated by the rich colors of tapestries and paintings. The palette felt distinctly Mediterranean, evoking the sun-baked walls of Italian villas and Spanish courtyards rather than the brighter, cooler colors popular in contemporary American homes. Lighting presented unique challenges. The villa was built during a transitional period when electricity was becoming standard, but still relatively new. Deering wanted modern electrical lighting, but couldn't allow visible modern fixtures to break the historical illusion. The solution involved concealing electric lights in period-appropriate fixtures, candelabras, and sconces, designed to look like they held candles, but actually containing electric bulbs. Walking through these main entertaining spaces, visitors began to understand James Deering's vision. He hadn't created a museum filled with roped-off artifacts. He had created a living environment where modern comfort existed within a carefully constructed historical aesthetic. Every room served a function. Every space could be used, inhabited, enjoyed. The villa wasn't a stage set to be admired from a distance. It was a home, albeit an extraordinarily elaborate one. The attention to detail was remarkable. Door handles, window latches, light switches, floor tiles, wall textures, everything was considered and designed to maintain the illusion. Nothing felt obviously modern or out of place. The effect was cumulative and powerful. The more time visitors spent in these rooms, the more completely they accepted the villa's claim to historical authenticity. Chapter 5. Private Worlds. While the public rooms of Villa Vizcaya were designed to impress visitors and create a sense of timeless European grandeur, the private quarters revealed a different aspect of James Deering's personality. Here, in bedrooms, studies, and personal spaces, the balance between theatrical fantasy and practical living became more apparent. James Deering's own bedroom suite occupied a prime location with views overlooking Biscayne Bay. The room was surprisingly restrained compared to the elaborate public spaces. Deering didn't need to impress himself. He needed comfort, particularly given his ongoing health problems. The bedroom featured a large, comfortable bed, ample natural light, and direct access to outdoor terraces where he could enjoy fresh air. The furnishings in Deering's bedroom reflected his personal taste rather than theatrical display. The pieces were fine quality, but not ostentatious. The decoration leaned toward simpler Renaissance styles rather than the more ornate Baroque or Rococo aesthetics found elsewhere in the villa. This was a room designed for rest, for privacy, for the quiet hours when the performance of wealth and culture could be set aside. Deering's bathroom revealed the villa's hidden modernity. While the fixtures and decoration maintained a period aesthetic, the plumbing was state-of-the-art for the 1920s. Hot and cold, running water, modern drainage, carefully designed ventilation, all the conveniences of contemporary life were present but disguised. The bathroom demonstrated Deering's practical approach to the historical illusion. Fantasy extended only as far as comfort allowed. Adjacent to the bedroom was Deering's private study, a space where he could work, read, and think without the formal atmosphere that pervaded the public areas. The study housed part of his book collection, personal papers and artifacts that held particular meaning for him. This room felt more intimate, more revealing of the man behind the estate. The decoration was less about impressing guests and more about surrounding himself with things he genuinely loved. The guest suites scattered throughout the villa's upper floors each had distinct characters. Chalfin designed them with varying historical themes, giving each room its own personality while maintaining overall coherence. Some rooms emphasized Renaissance simplicity, others explored Baroque drama or neoclassical restraint. This variety meant that returning guests could experience different aspects of European design history during different visits. The most elaborate guest room was the Pantaleo room, decorated in the Rococo style with elaborate painted walls, ornate furniture, and a level of decorative excess that Deering generally avoided in his own spaces. The room was named after the Italian artist whose style inspired its decoration. It represented the most extreme expression of European aristocratic taste in the entire villa, a fantasy within the larger fantasy. These guest rooms were not merely decorative showpieces. Deering used them frequently. Villa Vizcaya served as his winter residence, and he regularly hosted extended visitors. Friends, business associates, family members, they all stayed in these carefully designed spaces. The rooms had to function as actual bedrooms while maintaining their aesthetic roles in the overall villa composition. Service areas throughout the villa revealed the infrastructure necessary to maintain the historical illusion. The kitchen was located away from the main living areas following traditional estate design principles. It featured modern equipment concealed as much as possible behind period-appropriate facades. Industrial-scale cooking equipment, refrigeration, modern ventilation, all the necessities of running a grand household were present but hidden from view. The electrical systems, plumbing, heating, and other modern conveniences were carefully integrated into the structure. Deering wanted comfort and efficiency, but he didn't want visible reminders of modernity disrupting the atmosphere. Radiators were concealed behind decorative grills. Electric wiring ran through walls and ceilings, invisible except for the carefully designed fixtures. The telephone system, essential for running the estate and Deering's business affairs, was installed but kept as unobtrusive as possible. Staff quarters were separate from the main house, following the traditional pattern of grand estates. Deering employed a substantial staff to maintain the villa and grounds. Gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, maintenance workers. The estate required dozens of employees to function. These workers had their own living spaces, dining areas, and work facilities, all designed to keep the machinery of the household running smoothly while remaining invisible to guests. The relationship between the villa's public image and its private reality was fascinating. Guests moving through the formal rooms experienced an immersive historical fantasy. They saw Renaissance ceilings, antique furniture, classical art, everything suggesting they had stepped back in time. But behind the scenes, modern systems made that fantasy possible. Without electricity, plumbing, modern kitchens, and efficient heating and cooling, the villa couldn't have functioned as a comfortable residence. This duality revealed something important about Deering's approach. He was not an antiquarian trying to recreate past living conditions authentically. He was a modern man using modern resources to create an aesthetic experience based on the past. He wanted to live surrounded by the beauty of the Renaissance, but he had no interest in living with the inconveniences of Renaissance-era technology. The private spaces also showed that Deering understood the difference between performance and reality. The public rooms were stages where he could entertain, impress, and share his vision with others. The private rooms were where he actually lived, where health and comfort took priority over theatrical effect. The villa accommodated both needs successfully, creating distinct zones for public fantasy and private practicality. Walking through the private areas of Villa Vizcaya today, visitors gain insight into James Deering as a person rather than just as a wealthy collector. The choices he made for his own spaces, the balance he struck between beauty and comfort, the way he integrated modern convenience with historical aesthetic, all of these reveal a thoughtful, sophisticated approach to living. The private quarters demonstrated that the villa's elaborate historical illusion was exactly that, an illusion deliberately created and carefully maintained. Deering never confused the fantasy with reality. He knew he was building something new that looked old. He understood the difference between authentic and fabricated. The private spaces showed that he could step behind the curtain of his own creation whenever necessary. Chapter 6. Gardens of Fantasy. Beyond the walls of Villa Vizcaya stretched what many consider the estate's greatest achievement. The gardens, designed by Diego Suarez with input from Paul Chalfin, transformed 10 acres of tropical landscape into an elaborate fantasy of Italian formal gardens, complete with fountains, sculptures, grottos, and manicured hedges that seemed impossibly perfect for the Florida climate. Diego Suarez faced an enormous challenge. Italian Renaissance gardens relied on specific design principles developed over centuries in Mediterranean climates: axial symmetry, geometric precision, carefully controlled plant selections, elaborate water features. These elements defined the tradition Suarez was expected to recreate. But Florida offered conditions completely unlike Italy. The heat was more intense. The rainfall was heavier and less predictable. The soil composition was different. Native plants grew aggressively, constantly threatening to overwhelm carefully planned compositions. Suarez's solution was adaptation rather than exact replication. He studied Italian garden design principles and then modified them to work in subtropical conditions. The formal structure remained: geometric garden rooms connected by pathways, central axes creating visual organization, fountains and sculpture providing focal points. But the plant selections had to be different, incorporating tropical species that could survive Florida's climate while maintaining the aesthetic character of European gardens. The stone barge became Villa Vizcaya's most iconic feature. Designed as a breakwater to protect the shoreline from erosion, it took the form of an elaborate Venetian barge carved from stone. The structure sat in Biscayne Bay, just offshore from the villa, appearing to float on the water. Mythological figures decorated the barge, obelisks rose from its deck, and the entire composition created a fantastical element that became the estate's most photographed feature. The barge served practical purposes beyond erosion control. It created a visual terminus for the garden's central axis, drawing the eye from the villa down through the gardens to the water. It provided a destination for walks, a place to sit and enjoy views of the bay and the villa from a different perspective. It functioned as sculpture, architecture, and landscape elements simultaneously. The formal gardens were organized into distinct sections, each with its own character and purpose. The fountain garden featured elaborate water displays, multiple fountains arranged in geometric patterns creating sound and movement that animated the space. Water in Renaissance gardens symbolized wealth and control over nature. The ability to move water to make it flow and cascade at will demonstrated both technical sophistication and economic power. The secret garden offered a more intimate experience, enclosed by walls and hedges, designed for quiet contemplation rather than grand display. This smaller space demonstrated Suarez's understanding that gardens needed variety in scale and mood. Not every area could be monumental. Some spaces needed to feel protected, hidden, personal. The theater garden referenced the ancient tradition of outdoor performance spaces in Italian estates. A semicircular seating area faced a small stage space, creating an environment where musical performances or theatrical entertainments could occur in garden surroundings. The garden theater was rarely used for actual performances at Vizcaya, but its presence reinforced the historical authenticity Deering sought. The maze garden featured elaborate hedges arranged in geometric patterns that created pathways for exploration. Hedge mazes were common in European gardens, serving both decorative and recreational purposes. Walking through the maze became a game, a puzzle to solve, a way of engaging actively with the landscape rather than simply observing it. Throughout the gardens, sculpture played a crucial role. Classical figures, mythological scenes, decorative urns, these elements were distributed strategically to create focal points, mark intersections, and reinforce the garden's Italian character. Some of the sculptures were genuine European antiques, others were high-quality reproductions created specifically for Vizcaya. As with the villa's interior, Chalfin mixed authentic and fabricated elements strategically. The water features required sophisticated engineering. Florida's water table was high, which helped with creating ponds and pools, but the elaborate fountain systems required pumps, pipes, and reservoirs. The fountains had to function reliably in a climate that was often harsh on mechanical systems. Salt air from the bay corroded metal components, heat stressed pumps and motors. Maintaining the water features required constant attention and regular maintenance. Plant selection revealed Suarez's skill at creating visual effects that suggested European gardens while using species that could actually survive in Florida. He couldn't use many traditional Italian garden plants. Boxwood hedges, so common in European gardens, struggled in Florida's heat and humidity. Cypress trees, another Italian garden staple, had to be carefully selected for varieties that could tolerate subtropical conditions. Suarez substituted tropical and subtropical plants that created similar visual effects. Native and adapted palms provided vertical elements. Tropical flowering plants added color. Vines and climbing plants softened stone walls and created the impression of age and growth. The result looked convincingly European to casual observers, but knowledgeable horticulturists would recognize the adaptations Suarez had made. Maintenance presented enormous ongoing challenges. European gardens in their native climates required regular care, but Florida's aggressive growing conditions demanded constant vigilance. Plants grew faster than anticipated. Tropical storms damaged carefully pruned hedges. Hurricanes destroyed years of horticultural work in hours. The gardens required a permanent staff of skilled gardeners, working year-round to maintain their designed appearance. The ruin aesthetic appeared in the gardens as it did in the villa itself. Certain areas were designed to look weathered and aged. Stone walls showed deliberate distressing. Fountains appeared worn by centuries of use. Sculptures seemed to have stood in place for generations. This artificial aging created consistency between the gardens and the villa, suggesting that both had existed for much longer than their actual 10 years. The gardens didn't just complement Villa Vizcaya, they completed the fantasy. Walking from the villa into the gardens, visitors remained within the carefully constructed illusion. Every view had been planned. Every pathway led to designed destinations. The experience was total and immersive, a complete environment that transported visitors out of 1920s Florida and into a reimagined Renaissance Italy. The achievement was remarkable precisely because it was so difficult. Creating European-style gardens in Florida required fighting against the environment constantly. Every manicured hedge, every blooming flower, every carefully trimmed tree represented a victory over nature. The gardens demonstrated that with sufficient resources, expertise, and determination, even the most improbable aesthetic visions could be realized. Chapter 7. The Deering Years. When Villa Vizcaya was completed in 1922, James Deering finally had the winter residence he had dreamed of for more than a decade. The villa became his retreat from the Chicago winters that aggravated his respiratory problems, his escape from the industrial world that had created his family's fortune, his private paradise where he could live surrounded by the beauty he had spent years collecting and arranging. Deering used the villa primarily during Florida's winter season, roughly from December through March. He would arrive as Chicago's weather turned cold and remain through the early spring, enjoying the mild Florida climate and the carefully cultivated atmosphere of his Italian fantasy. The rest of the year, the villa was maintained by a permanent staff, but saw little use from its owner. The winter months at Vizcaya followed patterns familiar to wealthy Americans who maintained seasonal residences. Deering entertained frequently, inviting friends, business associates, and cultural figures to visit the estate. Guests would stay for days or weeks, enjoying the gardens, the villa's remarkable art collection, and the sense of being transported to a different world entirely. Entertainment was relatively quiet and refined. Musical performances in the music room, dinners in the formal dining room. Afternoon tea in the tea room or on garden terraces, walks through the grounds. Boat excursions on Biscayne Bay. Deering was not interested in wild parties or ostentatious displays. He preferred cultivated conversation, appreciation of art and music, and the peaceful enjoyment of beautiful surroundings. The estate required an enormous staff to function properly. Gardeners maintained the 10 acres of formal landscapes, fighting constantly against Florida's aggressive vegetation. Housekeepers cleaned and maintained the villa's 34 rooms. Cooks prepared meals for Deering and his guests. Maintenance workers handled repairs and the constant upkeep that a building in Florida's climate required. Additional staff managed the grounds, the boats, the vehicles, and all the other infrastructure of a major estate. Deering remained relatively private despite his wealth and the villa's magnificence. He was not particularly interested in Miami's small but growing social scene. He didn't seek publicity or attention. Villa Vizcaya was his personal retreat, not a public showplace. Most Miami residents knew of the estate's existence, but never saw it. Deering granted few tours and gave no interviews about his creation. The relationship between Deering and Paul Chalfin continued after the villa's completion. Chalfin remained involved as artistic advisor, helping Deering continue to acquire art and decorative objects for the villa. The collection kept growing. New paintings were added, furniture was rearranged. The villa was never quite finished in Deering's mind. It remained a work in progress, constantly being refined and improved. Deering's health, the reason he had built the villa in the first place, remained fragile. The Florida climate helped, but it could not cure his underlying respiratory problems. He managed his condition carefully, avoiding overexertion, spending time outdoors when weather permitted, and following his doctor's recommendations. The villa provided an environment where he could live comfortably despite his limitations. The early 1920s were significant years for Miami. The city was experiencing rapid growth, transforming from a small frontier town into a recognizable urban center. The real estate boom was beginning, bringing speculators, developers, and new residents to South Florida. Deering witnessed this transformation from his estate on Biscayne Bay, watching Miami change around him. Villa Vizcaya itself influenced this development. The estate demonstrated that South Florida could support sophisticated architecture and refined living. Other wealthy northerners took notice. Mediterranean revival architecture became increasingly popular in Miami and neighboring communities. Coral Gables, developed in the 1920s, adopted similar aesthetic principles on a community-wide scale. Vizcaya helped establish the architectural character that would define South Florida for decades. But Deering's time at his beloved villa was limited. In September 1925, while aboard a ship returning to the United States from Europe, James Deering died. He was 66 years old. His death came suddenly, likely from pernicious anemia, a blood disorder that was poorly understood and difficult to treat at the time. He died without ever writing a detailed account of his intentions for Villa Vizcaya or his vision for its future. The estate passed to Deering's heirs, primarily his nieces and nephews. The family continued using Vizcaya as a winter residence, maintaining the property much as Deering had left it. But without his guiding vision and personal attachment, the villa began a slow transition from private home to something else entirely. The 1926 Miami hurricane struck just over a year after Deering's death. The powerful storm caused significant damage to Villa Vizcaya. The gardens suffered particularly badly. Carefully cultivated plants were destroyed, trees were toppled. The elaborate landscape that Diego Suarez had created over years of careful work was devastated in a single night. The villa itself sustained damage to roofs, windows, and decorative elements. The family repaired the damage, but the hurricane revealed the vulnerability of maintaining such an elaborate estate in Florida's harsh climate. Without Deering's passionate commitment and unlimited resources, keeping Vizcaya in perfect condition became increasingly difficult. The gardens were restored but never quite regained their original perfection. Subsequent storms in the 1930s caused additional damage, each time requiring expensive repairs. The Great Depression added financial pressures. Maintaining Villa Vizcaya cost a fortune even when the economy was strong. During the Depression, with reduced family income and economic uncertainty, the estate became an increasing burden. The family continued maintaining it, but questions arose about the property's future. How long could they sustain such an expensive and elaborate residence? World War II brought additional challenges. Materials became scarce, labor was difficult to find as workers joined military service or moved into war industries. The estate's maintenance suffered from practical necessity. By the war's end, Villa Vizcaya showed signs of aging and neglect that would have been unthinkable during Deering's lifetime. The Deering family faced a decision. They could continue maintaining the estate at great expense, they could sell it for private development, or they could explore other options that might preserve Villa Vizcaya's unique character. The choice they made would determine whether Deering's fantasy would survive or disappear. Chapter 8. Transformation and Preservation. In 1952, the Deering family made a decision that would preserve Villa Vizcaya for future generations. Rather than selling the estate for private development or continuing the expensive struggle to maintain it themselves, they sold the property to Dade County for use as a public museum. The sale price was $1 million, a fraction of what Deering had spent building the estate 30 years earlier. The decision to become a museum transformed Villa Vizcaya from a private fantasy into a public cultural institution. What had been James Deering's personal retreat would now welcome thousands of visitors each year. The villa's rooms, once filled with the private moments of a wealthy industrialist and his guests, would become galleries where the public could experience early 20th century collecting and design. Opening Villa Vizcaya to the public required significant preparation. The estate needed infrastructure that private residences didn't require. Visitor pathways had to be established. Restrooms needed to be added. Parking areas had to be created. Staff had to be hired and trained. The transition from home to museum involved practical changes that had to be managed carefully to avoid damaging the very qualities that made the estate worth preserving. The museum opened to the public in 1953. Early visitors were fascinated by what they found. Here was a world completely unlike anything else in Florida. Walking through Villa Vizcaya meant entering a carefully preserved fantasy, a place where European Renaissance architecture and design had been transplanted to the American subtropics. The villa offered an experience that no other museum in the region could provide. The gardens presented particular challenges for the new museum administration. Maintaining the elaborate landscapes required expertise, labor, and ongoing investment. The original garden staff had dispersed after the Deering years, and their specialized knowledge of how to maintain Italian-style gardens in Florida's climate was difficult to replace. The museum had to develop new approaches to garden conservation, balancing historical accuracy with practical horticultural realities. Hurricane damage remained an ongoing concern. Major storms in the 1960s and subsequent decades repeatedly damaged the gardens and threatened the villa itself. Each hurricane required expensive repairs and raised questions about how much restoration was appropriate. Should damaged elements be replaced exactly as they had been, or should the museum accept that the gardens would change over time in response to natural forces? The stone barge, Villa Vizcaya's most iconic feature, suffered particularly from exposure to salt water and storms. The elaborate carved stonework deteriorated steadily. Waves eroded the foundation. The structure that had seemed so permanent and timeless when first constructed proved vulnerable to the very elements it was designed to withstand. Major restoration projects became necessary to save the barge from collapse. As decades passed, Villa Vizcaya's significance became clearer. The estate represented not just one man's taste and vision, but an entire era in American cultural history. The early 20th century was a time when American wealth sought to claim European cultural heritage, when new money tried to purchase the patina of old aristocracy, when collecting and display became expressions of personal identity and national ambition. Scholars began studying Villa Vizcaya seriously. Art historians analyzed the collection. Architectural historians examined the villa's design and construction. Garden historians documented Suarez's landscape work. The estate became a subject of academic research, helping people understand how Americans in the early 1900s thought about beauty, culture, and their relationship to European tradition. In 1994, Villa Vizcaya received National Historic Landmark designation. recognizing its exceptional value in American history and culture. This designation brought prestige but also responsibility. As a National Historic Landmark, the estate had to be maintained according to strict preservation standards. Any changes or restoration work required careful documentation and approval from preservation authorities. The museum's approach to preservation evolved over time. Early restoration efforts sometimes prioritized making the villa look perfect over maintaining historical authenticity. Later, preservation work became more sophisticated, understanding that signs of age and use were themselves historically significant. Contemporary preservation philosophy seeks to maintain the villa as a document of its own history, including the changes and deteriorations that have occurred over decades. Funding preservation work at Villa Vizcaya has required constant effort. The museum operates through a combination of admission fees, private donations, grants, and public support from Miami-Dade County. Major restoration projects like stabilizing the stone barge or conserving decorative painted ceilings cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The museum must continuously raise money to address preservation needs, while also funding educational programs and day-to-day operations. Climate change has emerged as a new threat to Villa Vizcaya's survival. Rising sea levels threaten the estate's waterfront location. Increased storm intensity puts the gardens and buildings at greater risk. The museum has had to develop climate adaptation strategies, considering how to protect the estate from environmental changes that Deering could never have anticipated. The transformation from private residence to public museum changed how people experience Villa Vizcaya. Deering's guests experienced the estate as a living environment, staying in the rooms, using the spaces, enjoying the gardens as part of daily life. Museum visitors experience it as a preserved historical environment, observed but not inhabited. The villa has become a document, a teaching tool, a window into the past rather than a functioning home. Yet this transformation also ensured Villa Vizcaya's survival. Had the estate remained in private hands, it almost certainly would have been sold, demolished, or altered beyond recognition decades ago. The decision to become a museum preserved Deering's vision, making it accessible to millions of people who would never have seen it otherwise. The fantasy became public property, shared heritage rather than private possession. Chapter 9. The meaning of illusion. Villa Vizcaya stands as more than a beautiful building or an impressive garden. It represents a particular moment in American history when new wealth sought to claim old culture, when industrial fortunes tried to purchase the patina of European aristocracy, and when creating beauty mattered as much as the authenticity of that beauty's origins. James Deering was part of a generation of wealthy Americans who faced a peculiar problem. They had money, enormous amounts of it, earned through industry, innovation, and the rapid economic development of the United States. But they lacked the centuries of family history and cultural tradition that European aristocrats took for granted. American wealth was new and its newness showed. The grand tour and the collecting tradition it inspired offered a solution. If Americans couldn't inherit European culture, they could buy it. Art, architecture, decorative objects. Entire rooms could be purchased, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled in American homes. This cultural transfer created the great American art collections, filled American museums, and shaped American taste in architecture and design. Villa Vizcaya took this impulse to an extreme. Deering didn't just collect European art and architecture, he created an entire European environment, a complete world where he could live as if he were part of that older, more refined tradition. The villa allowed him to claim membership in a cultural aristocracy, even though his actual ancestry was American middle class. The elaborate illusion Deering created raises interesting questions about authenticity and value. Is a building less meaningful because it pretends to be older than it actually is? Does the fact that Villa Vizcaya was built in the 1910s and 1920s rather than the Renaissance make it less worthy of preservation? Should we value the authentic fragments incorporated into the villa more than the skillful reproductions surrounding them? These questions don't have simple answers. Villa Vizcaya challenges our assumptions about what makes architecture and art significant. The villa is simultaneously genuine and fake, authentic and fabricated, historically important and historically deceptive. It exists in a complex space where multiple truths coexist without canceling each other out. What the villa reveals about James Deering is equally complex. He was clearly a man of refined taste and genuine appreciation for beauty. The care and attention to detail evident throughout Villa Vizcaya demonstrate real aesthetic sensibility. He understood quality, pursued it relentlessly, and achieved results that remain impressive a century later. But Deering was also performing. The villa was theater, a stage set where he could act out a particular kind of life. He was playing the role of European aristocrat living in a palazzo, entertaining in formal gardens, surrounded by Renaissance art. The performance was elaborate and expensive, but it remained so performance. Behind the costume and scenery, Deering was still an American industrialist's son with health problems and modern conveniences hidden in his historical fantasy. The relationship between the villa and Miami is significant. Deering built his European fantasy in one of America's least European locations. Florida was frontier, wilderness, tropical heat, and aggressive vegetation. The contrast between the villa's refined formality and the surrounding environment was deliberate and dramatic. The villa stood as an assertion that culture could triumph over nature, that beauty could be imposed on wilderness through sufficient will and resources. This impulse reflected broader American attitudes in the early 20th century. The country was asserting itself culturally, attempting to prove that American achievement extended beyond industry and commerce into art and refinement. Estates like Villa Vizcaya were arguments in this cultural debate, demonstrations that Americans could create beauty equal to anything Europe had produced. The ethical dimension of Deering's collecting deserves consideration. He purchased European architectural fragments and art legally, but the circumstances often involved desperate sellers and imbalanced power dynamics. Post-World War I Europe was economically devastated. Impoverished nobles sold family treasures. Demolished buildings released architectural elements onto the market. Deering had money and they had beautiful things they needed to sell. Contemporary preservation ethics would question many of these transactions. We now generally believe that cultural heritage should remain in its place of origin when possible, that removing architectural elements from historic buildings diminishes both the object and the structure it came from. But these ethical standards were developing during Deering's lifetime. He operated within the legal and ethical framework of his era, which permitted practices we would now question. The villa's transformation into a museum changed its meaning. What was private became public. What was exclusive became accessible. The fantasy Deering created for himself now serves educational purposes he never intended. Thousands of people each year learn about history, architecture, art, and design by experiencing Villa Vizcaya. The estate teaches in ways a private residence never could. Villa Vizcaya also raises questions about how we relate to the past. The villa demonstrates that our connection to history is always mediated, always constructed, always filtered through our own needs and desires. Deering didn't experience the Renaissance. He experienced his own fantasy about what the Renaissance meant, shaped by early 20th century assumptions and his personal aesthetic preferences. His villa reveals more about 1920s America than about Renaissance Italy. Yet the beauty is real. Whatever we think about the villa's authenticity, its historical accuracy, or the ethics of its creation, the aesthetic achievement remains genuine. The gardens are beautiful. The architecture is impressive. The art collection is significant. The overall experience of visiting Villa Vizcaya can be profound and moving. Beauty doesn't require perfect authenticity to affect us deeply. This may be Villa Vizcaya's most important lesson, the relationship between authentic and fabricated, real and imagined, historical and contemporary is more complex than simple categories suggest. The villa exists in the spaces between these oppositions, creating value through the very ambiguities it embodies. Chapter 10. The Villa Today. Villa Vizcaya today welcomes more than 200,000 visitors each year who come to experience James Deering's carefully constructed fantasy. They walk through rooms filled with European antiques, stroll through Italian-inspired gardens, and photograph the stone barge floating in Biscayne Bay. Most leave enchanted by the beauty. Some leave wondering about the illusion. All leave having encountered something that challenges simple categories of authentic or fake, historic or modern, meaningful or superficial. The museum operates year-round, offering tours, educational programs, and cultural events. The villa hosts weddings, concerts, and special exhibitions. The gardens provide peaceful spaces for contemplation and photography. The estate serves multiple functions simultaneously, functioning as museum, cultural venue, educational resource, and community gathering place. Preservation challenges continue to occupy the museum's attention and resources. Florida's climate remains harsh on historic buildings. Salt air corrodes metal. Humidity promotes mold and deterioration. Sunlight fades fabrics and paintings. Storms threaten the structures and gardens. The museum fights a constant battle against natural forces that work to undo human creation. Recent preservation projects have addressed critical needs. The stone barge underwent major stabilization work to prevent its collapse into Biscayne Bay. Interior conservation projects have cleaned and stabilized painted ceilings, decorative plasterwork, and historic furnishings. Garden restoration efforts attempt to recreate Suarez's original designs while adapting to contemporary horticultural realities and climate change impacts. The museum's educational programming helps visitors understand what they're experiencing. Tours explain the villa's history, Deering's collecting practices, and the techniques used to create the historical illusion. Educational materials explore the broader context of Gilded Age collecting, Mediterranean revival architecture, and the transformation of South Florida in the early 20th century. Contemporary visitors bring different perspectives to Villa Vizcaya than Deering's original guests would have had. We understand more about the ethics of cultural heritage. We question the power dynamics involved in wealthy Americans purchasing European art. We recognize the environmental costs of maintaining elaborate gardens in inappropriate climates. We see complexities that Deering's generation might have overlooked or dismissed, yet these critical perspectives coexist with genuine appreciation. Villa Vizcaya remains beautiful despite the questions it raises. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The design sophistication is evident. The overall achievement impresses even those who question the values and assumptions behind it. The estate can be simultaneously problematic and magnificent, troubling and wonderful. Villa Vizcaya's influence on Miami's architectural identity persists. The Mediterranean revival style that Deering helped popularize became the region's signature aesthetic. Coral Gables, Miami Beach, and countless other South Florida communities adopted similar design principles. The villa helped establish the visual character that defines the region to this day. The estate also serves as a reminder of what Miami was before it became a major metropolis. When Deering built Villa Vizcaya, Miami was small, quiet, undeveloped. The villa preserves a memory of that earlier moment. Before the skyscrapers and highways, before the enormous population growth and urban sprawl, it stands as an artifact from a vanished era in South Florida history. Climate change poses existential questions for Villa Vizcaya's future. Rising sea levels threaten the waterfront location. Stronger hurricanes endanger the buildings and gardens. The museum must plan for scenarios that could make the current site untenable within decades. How do you preserve a place-specific estate when the place itself is changing fundamentally? These challenges require creative thinking and difficult decisions. Should the museum invest in infrastructure to protect against sea level rise? Should certain elements be relocated if they cannot be protected in place? How much change can Villa Vizcaya undergo and still remain Villa Vizcaya? The museum grapples with questions that have no easy answers. Despite these uncertainties, Villa Vizcaya continues to fascinate and inspire. Students study the estate's architecture and design. Artists find inspiration in the gardens and interiors. Historians analyze what the villa reveals about American culture and identity. Tourists from around the world visit to experience beauty they cannot find elsewhere. The villa teaches that human creativity takes many forms. James Deering's achievement wasn't original invention. It was sophisticated borrowing, skillful adaptation, and the vision to combine existing elements into something new. He didn't create a style. He recreated styles he admired, transforming them through the very act of transplantation. Villa Vizcaya also demonstrates that beauty requires resources. The estate exists because Deering had enormous wealth and was willing to spend it creating something beautiful. The thousands of hours of skilled labor, the expensive materials, the imported art and architecture, all Of this required money on a scale most people cannot imagine. The villa embodies what wealth can achieve when directed toward aesthetic rather than purely practical goals. The estate reminds us that illusion has power. Deering created a fantasy, but that fantasy has outlasted him by a century. The illusion became permanent. The dream became real. Not in the sense that Villa Vizcaya actually is a Renaissance Italian palazzo, but in the sense that it exists as a physical reality that people can experience, study, and preserve. Villa Vizcaya may have been built as an elaborate performance, but its impact is entirely genuine. It shaped Miami's architectural identity, preserved European artworks and craftsmanship, created jobs for thousands of workers, and provided a space where beauty could exist for its own sake. The villa shows that even fabricated authenticity can create real value, that copies and reconstructions can be meaningful, that new things pretending to be old can still matter. The greatest lesson Villa Vizcaya offers may be about the relationship between past and present. We cannot actually inhabit the past. We can only create present interpretations of what we imagine the past to have been. Deering understood this. He never claimed to have built an actual Renaissance villa. He built a 1920s American's fantasy about what such a villa might have been like. The honesty of that illusion, the transparency of its construction gives it integrity, despite its fabricated nature. Villa Vizcaya stands today much as James Deering left it a century ago. The limestone walls still rise from the tropical vegetation. The gardens still bloom in carefully arranged patterns. The stone barge still floats in Biscayne Bay. Visitors still walk through the rooms and feel transported to another time and place. The estate has survived hurricanes, economic depressions, changing tastes, and the transformation of Miami from small town to major metropolis. It has endured because people recognized its value, not just as one man's fantasy, but as a cultural resource worth preserving and sharing. What James Deering created was an illusion, carefully constructed and deliberately artificial. But illusions can be powerful. They can inspire, educate, and move us in ways that strict authenticity sometimes cannot. Villa Vizcaya proves that beauty doesn't always require perfect historical accuracy to be meaningful. The estate matters because it shows us what human creativity, resources, and determination can achieve when focused on creating something extraordinary. The villa reminds us that America's cultural identity has always been complex, borrowed, and constructed. We are a nation of transplants, immigrants, and adopters. We take what we admire from other cultures and make it our own. Villa Vizcaya embodies this process perfectly. It is European architecture in America, Renaissance design in the 20th century, formal Italian gardens in tropical Florida. It exists in the spaces between categories, challenging us to think more carefully about what makes places, objects, and experiences valuable. More than a century after construction began, Villa Vizcaya continues to captivate visitors with its beauty and intrigue them with its history. The estate that James Deering built to escape his own time has become a window into that very era, preserving not just objects and architecture, but an entire way of thinking about culture, beauty, and identity. The illusion has outlasted reality. The fantasy has become history. The dream that began in one man's imagination now belongs to everyone who walks through its gates. Villa Vizcaya stands as proof that even the most elaborate fabrications can become genuine treasures, and that beauty, however constructed, has the power to endure.